As our class concludes, we return to the historical scene where the wheat and tare merge together in the person of Herod the Great and Jesus the Christ. These two embody and epitomize the two world orders that have forever marked the history of mankind. Through the greatness of Caesar Augustus, the dictator of the Seven Hills, Herod began his unimpaired rule over the Jews of Palestine in 31 B.C. He has thus far climbed every height and weathered every storm, and he now stood at the mountain peak of his career. He had swept aside every life that his jealousy could conceive to be a menace to his rule, and of all the family of the Maccabees, not one remained with the exception of Miriam, who was his wife, and her children, who were also his. Their fate was now interwoven with his own. The wife and children could not be separated from the husband and father. By all evidence, Herod could feel secure. But cruelty cannot sleep soundly, nor jealousy rest secure, and this forms the nemesis of Herod's rule in the final years of the intertestamental period. Herod's position as the king of the Jews was unique, and so was his character. In terms of vacillations and contrasting moods, he had few parallels in the annals of history. In his mingled love and hate, in the strength of his family affections and the excesses of his public crimes, in his love of learning and his cruel cunning, in all these there is a versatility and vastness, a power alike for good and evil, that were as extraordinary as was his position as ruler of the Jew at the juncture of the rivers of time in B.C. and A.D. There is a very thin line between love and hate, virtue and vice in the life of Herod. He desired love, and yet he was ever doing that which made love to be impossible. He trusted no one, and yet he was always demanding others to trust him. As a husband, he was passionately devoted to his wife Miriam, and yet he was so egotistically selfish that twice, in the crisis of his affairs, he gave orders that in the event of his death, she too was to die. In the end, he climaxed his crime by her murder. As a father, he cherished high hopes for his children and embraced them with a fierce affection, and yet, one after another, his sons fell beneath his jealous suspicion. Following his reconciliation with Caesar Augustus and his reinstatement as king of the Jews, Herod was plagued with the marital and family issues. Whatever love Miriam may have had for her husband, it would not survive the systematic liquidation of her family, a liquidation which began with her grandfather and eventually embraced her father, brother, and uncle. And when she came to learn of Herod's cruel egotism that twice doomed herself, her love was quenched, and she accordingly treated Herod with a cold disdain that at times drove him to the borders of madness. As a daughter of the Maccabean lineage, Miriam also expressed her open contempt for her conniving sister-in-law Salome. Salome, in retaliation, successfully planted the seed of suspicion in Herod's mind that Miriam was plotting against his life, and when the burden of this thought was added to the reproach and scorn that Miriam already expressed towards him, Herod finally caused his wife to be tried, convicted, and condemned to death. When this deed was done, Herod's remorse bordered on insanity and retreat from reality, and to many it appeared that his days were numbered. Alexandra, Miriam's mother, seized the occasion and plotted to secure the succession of Miriam's son to the throne, but her measures were taken without caution, and the awareness of them aroused Herod from his lethargy, and with the liquidation of Alexandria, he returned to his old self. It was at this juncture in his life that Herod began the most brilliant period of his reign, a final glow, as it were, before the setting sun. With genius and energy, he now brought to accumulation those great public enterprises with which his name was to be forever identified. He founded and fortified cities, fostered industry and trade, and on every side the kingdom prospered through his benefactions. As he had craved the love of Miriam, so he now craved the love of his Jewish subjects, and he sought to achieve their response by casting his mantle of protection and beneficence over the Jewish communities throughout the kingdom. His efforts, however, were futile, and it was Herod's agony to know that the Jews inwardly hated him, even as Miriam had despised him. In spite of his lavish gifts and labors, the shades of the murder of the Maccabees stood forever between him and his subjects. Herod accumulated his enterprises of public works by rebuilding the temple at Jerusalem. Impelled by both his artistic enthusiasm and his political desire to excite the religious pride of his subjects, he rebuilt the temple on such a magnificent scale that it exceeded the work of Solomon. Until its final destruction in 70 A.D., it was known everywhere as Herod's Temple. Perhaps with the ambition to appear in his subjects' eyes as a greater than Solomon, so when Herod was finished, the temple project was turned to build a palace also. Here also the splendor and magnificence rivaled that of Solomon. The Jews were duly impressed with these Herodian ventures, but it was Herod's fate to be always undoing what one hand had accomplished with the other. In this instance, it was his introduction to Roman names and symbols that aroused the national susceptibilities and indignation of the Jews, and when at length he placed a golden eagle over the grand entrance to the temple, they interpreted it as an idolatrous sign. And when, in compliment to his imperial matron, he gave Roman names to his cities and palaces, they saw in this a hateful reminder of their foreign master. All of these public works and projects spanned several years, and they were the most worthy and productive of Herod's long reign. They were followed, however, by a renewed tragic chapter of family and domestic unrest and intrigue. It began when two sons of Miriam, who had been educated at Rome under the eye of the emperor, returned to Jerusalem. These young men had now attained manhood, and the Jews saw in them the link that attached the reigning family to the Maccabees. On the neither side, the other sons of Herod, notably Antipater, saw in them rival contenders for the throne, while Salome viewed them as avengers of the wrong suffered by their mother Miriam. Together, Salome and Antipater spared no effort to arouse the suspicion of Herod. They accused the sons of bringing poison from Rome to be used against Herod, and of plotting to secure a popular uprising. Nothing was too distasteful to be suggested as a charge against them. Haunted by past guilt, Herod was again tormented by fears and seeds of suspicion, his hates and loves. Conscience may sleep in an era of prosperity, only to be aroused to new heat in times of crisis. So it was with Herod. The old jealousies that had slumbered during years of public enterprise now seized him anew. To render the situation even more acute for Herod, while his mind was suffering the chaos of doubt and fear, his body was gradually succumbing to the ravages of disease. At length, after long hesitation and much plotting, Antipater and Salome won the day. The sons of Miriam were subjected to a mock trial, condemned, and put to death by strangling. As after the death of Miriam, so now after the death of her sons, Herod's remorse was as violent as his crime was inexcusable. The plot of which the sons of Miriam were the victims was soon exposed, and Herod bitterly realized that his eldest son Antipater, for whom he had committed the crime, was the product of the evil genius of his own house. Having sown to the flesh, he is now reaping from the flesh corruption. Meanwhile, the domestic plotting went on. Antipater, having disposed of his greatest rivals, now became impatient that his father lingered so long upon the scene. In taking steps to hasten his father's departure by poison, his guilty plot was discovered, and he was cast into prison. Throughout this period of family intrigue and contention, Herod's physical and mental distemper deteriorated to extreme vileness. Added to these extreme physical tortures was Herod's piercing realization that there was no person in all his kingdom who was moved to love him or mourn for him. These were heavy burdens for him to bear, and with perverted ingenuity he devised a scheme to compel a national mourning when he died. He summoned the chief men of all the nation to Jerusalem and imprisoned them in the Hippodrome. He then charged Salome and her husband that the moment he died, the soldiers were to be ordered to slaughter all those who thus held captive. In this fashion, Herod sought to ensure himself a memorable national mourning at his death. Some final thoughts at the end of our study. From this scene of incarnate evil in which a dying Herod is still plotting death, it is now fitting to relate a contrasting and contemporaneous scene of incarnate love. In sharp distinction to the death of Herod is the birth of Jesus Christ. It is the year 4 BC, probably early in the year, for the flocks are on the plains. Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor, had issued an edict that all persons within his domain should be enrolled in their ancestral cities for purposes of taxation. One day this edict was posted in the village outpost of Nazareth in Galilee, and it affected two lives in a significant way. A village carpenter by the name of Joseph, who belonged to a royalty that was now broken, and a village maid named Mary, concerning whom the prophet century before had witnessed that to her would be born in the village of Bethlehem one whose name would be great unto the ends of the earth. It was a peculiar twist of history. The ruler of Rome, who was bent on world empire and recognition, became the unconscious instrument of divinity in fulfilling the prophecy that the giver of the world peace would come from Bethlehem. Things are not always as they seem if one climbs high enough to view life and events from the vantage point of a higher providence. Caesar Augustus thought he was enrolling the citizens of the world under his power. Actually, he had set wheels in motion that shifted the world's allegiance to the King of Kings. Countless feet were set in motion by the imperial decree that drifted across the Roman world, but none was more significant than those of the woman Mary. Her mind was filled with wonder concerning the child she was to bear, and the man Joseph who guarded and cared for her. It was a long journey as men traveled then to Nazareth, to Jerusalem, and then down to Bethlehem. Undoubtedly, their avenue of travel passed not far from the palace fortress in Jerusalem where Herod lay in pain and ill temper. The light of the third day was fading as they approached the ancestral city of David, and the only lodging available was at the end in the lower compartment reserved for the stabling of animals. And there in that lowly manger, Jesus Christ was born. This was the night of nights, the night for which ages had waited, and patriarchs and prophets and priests had long been preparing, at length had come. It was the fullness of time, and God sent forth his Son. From seed time to harvest, the cycle is now complete as eternity breaks forth into time. Omnipotent takes on bounds. God becomes man. Mary brings forth her living hosts. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. The contrast between the manger bed and stable inn of Jesus and the death couch and palace fortress of Herod is impressive and unrepeatable. Only a few miles, as men measure space, separate the two. But as God measures moral distance, a whole universe intervenes. Herod and Christ are at opposite poles. Infinity exists between the selfishness of the one who lived to slay and the self-sacrifice of the other who died to save. There are always Herods in life, Herods of envy and hate, Herods of greed and vice, all seeking to thwart the cause of righteousness and truth. But Herods finally and always die, while the Christ child lives on forever as the wonderful Counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.